The Sound Off Podcast. The podcast about broadcast with Matt Kundle. Starts now.
Rob Walch is the president of podcaster relations at Libsyn, one of the biggest and first podcast hosting companies. They built their clientele through community and trust. And you can hear that company culture come to life on the company's flagship podcast, The Feed, which is hosted by Rob and community manager Elsie Escobar every 2 weeks. And they answer questions about podcasting, and it's on my list of top 5 podcasts you should listen to if you want to learn more about podcasting. Rob was on this show back in 2018, and he's one of a collection of guests I could just bring back once a year just to talk about what's new in the business. Rob's presentation at Podcast Movement in August was one of the best. He talked a lot about the marketing myths about podcasting, and he's going to steer us through those truth and rumors behind all that podcast advice that is tossed about on the internet today. Rob Walch joins me from Nashville, Tennessee.
Podcast Movement was good. I had a good time. The attendance was lower than in previous years, but it was higher than I expected it to be, given I had been at an event in Nashville a couple weeks earlier that was normally 10,000 people, Summer NAMM, and it was less than 2,000. So less than 1/5 the turnout. And so Podcast Movement was about 1,200, 1,300 versus 3,000. So maybe a little bit more than a third. So from that perspective, it was well attended, given everything in this current crazy environment.
Now, you didn't have to travel far to go there because I think you've relocated to the area.
Yeah, I'm in Nashville now. So, and in my new studio, as you saw, which my wife was giving me grief when I was building this. And I said, honey, we live in Nashville. You can build a studio in your house. It's okay.
What was preventing you before in Kansas City?
The space to do it. I didn't have this house when I bought it. I was able to get an office with a room off of it, which was 9 by 10 that I could turn into a studio.
I couldn't join you for Podcast Movement in the room. Would have had to go Toronto, Chicago, Nashville, and I thought that might be a little bit too much for me. So I took in your presentation online, and it was quite extensive. I mean, you showed up with a lot of slides and did a lot of explaining about a lot of things that we're going to talk about today in this podcast. But safe to say it was well received.
It was. I got really good feedback on it. Even heads of one of the movie studios was there at the presentation, and got to talk with them afterwards, and they enjoyed the session. For some, it was an eye-opener. As always, for many people, it helps put things in perspective. That's what I try to do with the sessions, is try to break down some myths and talk about, hey, there was, one of the trends that I found that was the most interesting one when I was doing the research for the session was that there was a dip in the number of active podcasts. It actually had dipped, and it kept dipping, matter of fact, all the way through the end of August, where in April, we were at a peak of what I call active podcasts, is ones that have 10 episodes or more and have released something in the last 90 days. In April, that peaked at around 425,000. By the end of August, that number had dropped down to 275,000.
Why is it that people I'm going to write a book, I'm going to go record some music, I'm going to be a superstar. But when it comes to podcasting, they say, there's a lot of podcasts out there. I don't think I'm going to be able to compete with the 2.4 million podcasts that are out there.
Well, and that's the point. It's not 2.4. Active, 275,000. If you take any number of episodes on the feed, it's still under 500,000. That's a lot lower number. Unfortunately, people count in that 2.4 million, the million plus dead shows on Anchor, which you can't really count them. Those are shows where people came in, created one episode like, hey, I'm recording. Is this working? Hey, Mom, can you hear me? And that was their whole episode, and they never released another episode. But the feed is still active, so people count that. And I, one of the things I tried to say in the session was, don't count the 2.4 million from Apple or Spotify's 2.7 or 2.9 or Podcast Index's 4 million or whatever it is. Those numbers are so overinflated. When you look at the reality, it's less than 500,000 active podcasts out there. That's your competition. And that number is tiny compared to the 750 million blogs that are out there.
Do you think there's anything we can do to get rid of the one and dones?
I've talked to a couple of people that run different aggregator apps, and they've thought about putting in an anchor rule, which is basically if you have an anchor show that's 5 or less episodes and hasn't released anything in 90 days, it just takes it out of the directory. which I think would be great. That would definitely clear up a lot of the clutter. Unfortunately, it's a bad user experience for listeners. You go in, you search for a title, and you get 8 podcasts with that title, and 7 of them are dead. That's not what we want as a podcast industry to be putting out forth to listeners. That doesn't endear listeners to this medium. You go into Netflix, you find a show. It's actually a show. Unfortunately, podcasting is being known as a graveyard of dead podcasts.
A lot of people say, should I start my podcast on Anchor? And I say, would you build your business on a cemetery? Control
it. Have real control of your show and be at a place where people can take you seriously.
My crazy idea, which, is not necessarily practical for people at Apple, and that's every year have a renewal email that shows up that says, are you still podcasting? Is there somebody at the other end here and a reason why we should keep this podcast going? If you reply yes, you get to stay for another year. If not, you should go in the garbage. But I'm not here to tell Apple how to do their business.
There are podcasts that haven't released episodes in 7, 8, 9 years that absolutely should be in there. History of Rome, perfect example, right? He got through the History of Rome. The show gets 500,000 downloads a month. He hasn't released anything new in 7 or 8 years. Still as relevant today as it was 8 years ago, right? So there are definitely podcasts that have ended that still need to be in there. But most, if they've done 1 or 2 episodes and haven't done anything in 2 years, 6 months, probably should not be in there.
One of the things that really plagues commercial radio are the doggy commands and the number of times you tell people to be there and text now to win and, all this instructional stuff. But podcasting has one of its own, and that's please rate and review the podcast. Why do we continually ask people to rate and review the podcast when it really doesn't do much other than present a little social check mark?
There is bad advice that is the bad advice that's gone through this industry for so many years, because people thought that if you rate and review your show, it helped you in the rankings, which it does not. The rankings in Apple Podcasts are based on how many new subscribers, which now Apple calls followers, you've had in the last 7 days with a weighted average for 24, 48, and 72 hours. But it's not about ratings and reviews. Unfortunately, some Uber marketers classed on that and said, hey, I can give this advice. And there was a screen back in iTunes way back when. It was like, what's hot or something like that. And that had part of the algorithm was rating and reviews, but it didn't have any relevance for new and noteworthy. It didn't have any relevance for the top rankings. As a matter of fact, new and noteworthy is kind of gone other than for some of the key, the main page. So unfortunately, this advice keeps percolating through. And the reality is, who even looks at ratings and reviews when you're looking at a podcast? You look at what your friends told you to go listen to, and you go listen to it. You don't look at the ratings and reviews. You're not buying an air fryer, right? This isn't where you're spending money. It's free. And Apple has really changed how they want you to look at podcasts now. In the past, it was a big button when you found a show, and it said subscribe. Now that big button when you find a show is listen to the latest episode. And really, if you want to do something for your podcast, make sure the first 30 seconds, 60 seconds of your podcast has good content, because that 30 seconds of your most recent episode, that first 30 seconds, is the most important 30 seconds you have ever created. And unfortunately, people start stitching ads in the pre-roll. And now the first thing people hear when they click listen to the latest episode is an ad for Harry's Razors or Warby Parker. And it's like, that's not the best foot forward.
Tell me a little bit about the new 14.5 app. Apple made a lot of changes to it. And structurally for podcasters, one of the things we have to stop doing is asking people to subscribe, because that button has been replaced by follow.
Right. And it's really hard to find. It's up in the upper right. It's a little a little checkbox. Again, Apple has really changed what they want listeners to do. It's no longer they're trying to convince them to follow the show. You as a listener or as a podcaster really have to tell your listener where to go and how to follow, because it's not as intuitive as it was prior to 14.5. 14.4 and earlier, you search for a podcast, you found it, you came to that page, there was a big subscribe button. Now Apple doesn't even call it subscribe because they don't want you to get confused with the fact they're now selling subscriptions, which started after 14.5. Now they want you to click follow, wish kind of maybe because it's hidden up in that right with a little tiny button. They really, again, as I said, the big action Apple wants, they just want people to listen to the podcasts. And as a podcaster, you really want people to click follow because that's what helps you in the rankings. So you have to educate your listeners on here's where to go in 14.5 to click follow. And if you haven't listened to a podcast, and this is where you're going to have an edit point because I'm going to pull up one here.
Edit.
In the upper right, there's a plus symbol and you have to click that plus. And once it becomes a check mark, then it's set up to follow. And if it's a check mark, that also means it's set up to auto download. So that's what you're trying to tell your listeners to do. Follow and have it a check mark so that it auto downloads.
And I'm glad you mentioned that because it kind of helped me lead in so I didn't have to have a long, awful explanation about auto downloads. And they went away for the summer because Apple had a small bug and a lot of podcasts weren't auto downloading. That led to a little drop for a lot of people. And I thought to myself, I hope they don't bring it back because it seems to be if we don't auto download, we would wind up with a more real podcast metric than if it did.
Yeah, and it wasn't breaking it where it didn't auto-download at all. It was breaking it where it didn't auto-download if you didn't listen to most recent episodes. In the past, it didn't auto-download if you hadn't listened to 5 episodes in a row, and let's change it to if you hadn't listened to an episode since the last one downloaded. So it made the number more accurate. You're correct. The break was a unfortunately for some people, it hurt their numbers. Now, where it hurt people the most are people that were releasing episodes 5 days a week, multiple days, 7 days a week. Those people 3 times in a day. Those people saw a hit because people actually had to go and listen to an episode and then it would auto download the next one. So that's where it took a hit. But Apple did put it back to its previous actions with iOS 14.7 and 14.8 and now iOS 15. So it is back to how it used to work prior to iOS 14.5. But yeah, with 14.6 is when it broke it. We saw the numbers on some shows dropping 20-25%. Overall, it wasn't that big a drop for all shows. And some shows that were releasing every other week didn't even see any impact on their numbers because by the time the next episode came out, people had listened to it. People said, well, I didn't see a drop in my numbers. I'm like, good for you. You got an active audience. And other people are like, I saw a huge drop. And I'm like, you might want to try to reconnect with your audience.
That's exactly what I found. The podcasters that marketed well and stayed on top of their audience did not see a drop. Those who were not active and promoting their podcasts on a regular basis saw the drop.
I agree with you. It was a more accurate representation of your audience. And so it's unbroke and less accurate now. But it's back to where it was. And again, it wasn't all shows and it wasn't a huge number. And even in the biggest part of the drop, Apple Podcast app, which is really what it affected, went from 40% of our downloads to about 36% of our downloads. It wasn't huge, a number. Now they're back up to where they were before.
Another myth that you needed to debunk, and I think we've done a good job with this one. And that's the average length of a podcast being sort of around, and as you're squinting, it makes you cringe. This idea that it should sort of match commuter time between 22 and 28 minutes, it still pops up there, but there's really no correct answer to how long a podcast should be.
Right. What do you have content for? That's the real answer. But when you actually look at the most popular podcasts, they do tend to be longer. What we saw was around 80% of the shows in the top 200 were 40 minutes or longer. So that goes against what a lot of people are saying. Only 6% were 22 minutes or shorter in the top 200. So the most popular podcasts tend to be longer, but that doesn't mean making a show longer will make it popular. It just means that people in podcast world don't really care about the length. They just care about the content. And if it's good content, regardless of the length, it'll do well. Unfortunately, a lot of people think there's some magic marketing bullets you can follow that's going to cause your show to grow. Haven't seen that. Word of mouth marketing, great content, getting your audience to trust you and believe in you and tell their friends about you. That's what works in podcasting.
You know what I love about podcast movement and going every year is there's always one or two things that somebody will say that will make me pivot completely. And I love waking up every morning to the future. Podcasting is the future. And for years, I sort of resisted YouTube, did not feel the need to put up a still image in a show. You know, who's consuming it? And you showed up with some interesting information that made me change my mind this year, that said, you know, maybe we should have a still image of the show we're doing right now. We'll put it up on YouTube because there is searchability and value in it.
Right. And a lot of times when we tell people, hey, you should put up an episode with a still image in YouTube, they go, oh, well, my show's an hour long and my audience in YouTube is used to 5-minute videos. I'm like, did you know that Gmail accounts are free and you can register a new Gmail account for your still image videos? And you can upload to that Gmail account and not annoy your 5-minute video audience. And that's what we recommend. And, you know, Libsyn will convert your audio to the video automatically and upload it to YouTube. And that's what I do. I don't upload it to my videos where I'm going to do my unboxing videos and other active videos. I upload it to a different account so I don't annoy my YouTube audience with these still images. And people go, why even bother doing that? And as you mentioned, it's search, it's SEO. I mean, YouTube is the number 2 search engine in the world. And Google is making changes. You know, in the future, YouTube, when you do a search in YouTube, if it doesn't find something in YouTube, it's now going to go over to find stuff in Google, which means YouTube and Google are training YouTube users not to go Google things. They're training YouTubers to YouTube things. YouTuber, I don't know, what do you call it? YouTube search for things inside YouTube. So having your podcast in YouTube is going to be even more relevant in the future once Google makes those changes. So, you know, get it in there. And you never know when you're going to have a show pop. I did an interview a while back with Aaron Mahnke, and I put it up and for Podcast 411. And when Lore got picked up by Amazon Prime, or was it Amazon Video, or Amazon TV, whatever it is, and they were making it into a TV show, and everyone, who's this Aaron Mahnke guy? And they went into YouTube searching for interviews with him, and I had the one interview in there, and I had like 35, 50,000 views in a month, 2 months, because I just put it in YouTube. You know, much more than I got on the RSS feed.
Yeah, it's interesting you mentioned that. And, you know, Google for podcasters now, when we go in there, we can see who's searching and how people are connecting to audiences. And no surprise, it's the people who are being searched out in Google who connect to your podcast that way, which kind of leads me now into the next part, and that's websites. And having a website for your podcast and the importance of it. 80% of the people who come to me say, how do I make my podcast better? I'm like, just focus on your website, because a lot of them are a mess. So what makes a good podcast website?
Well, having one. And here's what I would say, making it